There are currents in a life that run deeper than you can perceive, silent rivers of intention that carve out new channels while you are busy navigating the surface. You believe you are in control, steering your small craft through the familiar waters of friendship and routine, only to look up one day and find yourself in an entirely different ocean, the coastline of everything you once knew having vanished behind you. For me, that shift did not announce itself with a storm or a great wave, but with a quiet, persistent gesture. It began, and for a long time existed, in the way Julian bit his lower lip. A small, anxious habit that became the focal point of my entire world, the tell in a game I hadn't even realized we were playing. It was a tell that I was terrified to understand, and even more terrified to misunderstand. A gesture that held the complete and catastrophic potential to either break my heart or remake my entire existence in a new, unbelievable light. He was asleep on my couch, a geography I knew better than any map. The worn navy blue corduroy, the dip in the cushion where he always sat, the faint scent of his laundry detergent that clung to the fabric long after he'd gone home. This time, he hadn't gone home. He was a long, lean line of dormant energy, one arm thrown over his eyes to block the sliver of morning light that pierced through the gap in my curtains. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm so slow and deep it seemed to anchor the entire room, pulling the silence into a comfortable, weighted blanket. I was at my drafting table, pretending to sort through a series of black and white prints from a recent shoot, but my focus was a fraud. My entire sensory apparatus was attuned to him, to the sound of his breathing, the subtle shift of his weight on the springs, the way the light caught on the sharp angle of his jaw. He had been a constant fixture in my life for years, a presence so familiar it felt like an extension of my own architecture. But this new iteration of our friendship was an uncharted territory, a room I had entered without knowing where the doors were. He stirred, a soft groan escaping his lips, and his arms slid from his face. His eyes remained closed, but his mouth tensed. And there it was, his lower lip, drawn in and held gently between his teeth. It wasn't a gesture of pain or intense concentration. It was something softer, more pensive. I had started cataloging the variations of this tic with the obsessive precision of a botanist classifying a new species of flower. There was the quick, nervous nip he employed when he was trying to solve a coding problem for work, his brow furrowed in frustration. There was the thoughtful, lingering hold he used when listening intently to someone, a sign that he was processing, really hearing them. And then there was this one, the one that had started appearing only recently, only when he was around me, in these quiet, unguarded moments. It was a gentle, almost tender pressure, his gaze distant even when his eyes were closed, as if he were tasting a memory or contemplating a word he couldn't bring himself to speak. It was this version that unraveled me, that sent a cascade of unanswerable questions through the quiet corridors of my mind. I held my breath, a fragile piece of glass in my hand, a photograph of a winter coastline where the sea met the rocks in a spray of frozen lace. It felt fitting. My entire emotional landscape felt like that photograph, stark, beautiful, and frozen in a state of perpetual impact. I watched him, this man who was my best friend, my anchor, the one person whose opinion of me was the sun my own self-worth orbited. He had crashed here 3 months ago, not literally, but emotionally, the wreckage of his 4-year relationship with Sarah scattered around him. And I, in my quiet, steady way, had become his harbor. But harbors have rules, defined boundaries between sea and shore, and we were drifting in a place where all the buoys had been cut loose. He was asleep on my couch, and I was in love with him, a fact I had packed away into the deepest, most inaccessible corner of my heart for nearly a decade. And now, his simple, unconscious gesture was prying the lid off that box, letting the contents spill out into the quiet air between us, shimmering and dangerous. We met in college, a collision of orbits that felt both random and preordained. Julian was a supernova on the swim team, all broad shoulders, easy laughter, and a chlorine-scented charisma that drew people to him like moths. He moved with a fluid, thoughtless grace, a creature perfectly at home in his own skin, while I was his polar opposite. I was the quiet observer, the arts student who haunted the campus darkroom, my world framed in the viewfinder of a vintage camera. I was more comfortable with shadows and light, with the fixed image of a moment, than I was with the messy, unpredictable flow of actual human interaction. I had a sports photography scholarship that required me to cover the swim meets, and so I spent hours watching him, my lens a safe barrier between his blinding light and my own shadowed existence. I learned the rhythm of his body before I ever learned the cadence of his voice, the powerful coil and release of his turn at the wall, the arc of water he displaced with each stroke, the look of focused exhaustion on his face when he surfaced, gasping for air, his eyes scanning the scoreboard. I was capturing his moments of triumph, freezing them on silver gelatin paper, but he was the one who first crossed the distance between our worlds. He found me one evening in the near-empty student union, hunched over a contact sheet, a red grease pencil in my hand. He smelled of damp towels and the vending machine coffee he was holding. I remember the sound of his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, a sound that made me instinctively look up, my guard immediately raised. He smiled, a genuine, uncomplicated thing that seemed to generate its own light source in the dim, fluorescent-lit hall. He pointed a long, dripping finger at one of the frames on my sheet. It was a shot I'd taken of him mid-stroke, his face half submerged, a single, perfect bead of water clinging to his eyelash like a diamond. He said my pictures made swimming look like flying, and the simple, unadorned compliment struck me with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever described my work that way. People called it technically proficient, well-composed, moody. He called it magic. That was the beginning. Our friendship bloomed in the unlikely soil between the jock-art-kid divide. We found a common language in our shared dedication to our respective crafts. He would talk about the relentless pursuit of shaving a millisecond off his time, the burning in his lungs, the monastic discipline of early morning practices. I would talk about the patient alchemy of the darkroom, the way an image slowly emerged from the chemical bath like a memory being coaxed into the present, the frustrating search for the perfect composition, the one that told the whole story in a single frame. We were both chasing a form of perfection, and we respected that in each other. He never treated my photography as a hobby, and I never treated his swimming as just a sport. He saw the art in my science, and I saw the science in his art. It was easy to be his friend. He was gravitational, and I found a strange comfort in his orbit. He pulled me into his social circles, introducing me with a casual pride that buffered me from my own shyness. "This is Leo," he'd say. "He's a genius. He makes still things feel alive," and I would stand there, blushing and awkward, while he filled the space with his effortless charm. I became the designated photographer of his life, documenting parties, road trips, championship meets. I have boxes of negatives from those years, a silent testament to our shared history. Julian laughing with his arm around Sarah, his then-girlfriend. Julian studying in the library, his brow furrowed in concentration. Julian standing on the winner's podium, medal around his neck, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. And through it all, I was there, just outside the frame, the quiet documentarian of a life I was a part of, but not fully in. The love I felt for him grew so slowly, so insidiously, that I barely noticed it taking root. It was a vine, wrapping itself around the foundations of our friendship, indistinguishable from the structure it clung to. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic lightning strike. It was more like the slow erosion of a coastline, a gradual reshaping of my interior world that only became obvious in retrospect. I realized it one night sophomore year. We were crammed onto the tiny dorm room sofa with a few of his teammates, watching some mindless action movie. I was wedged between Julian and the armrest, our shoulders and thighs pressed together. The heat from his body was a physical presence, a warmth that soaked through my jeans and my t-shirt, sinking into my skin. At some point, during a particularly loud explosion on screen, he had laughed and reflexively thrown an arm around my shoulders, pulling me closer. It was a casual, meaningless gesture, the kind of easy physical contact he offered to everyone in his sphere. But for me, it was a cataclysm. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every point of contact between our bodies became a focal point of excruciating awareness. The weight of his arm, the scent of his skin, the rumble of his voice in his chest that vibrated through me. In that moment, the comfortable architecture of our friendship fractured, and through the cracks, I saw the terrifying, beautiful, an utterly impossible truth. I did what any sensible, terrified person would do. I buried it. I built walls around that feeling, reinforced them with the bricks of our shared history and the mortar of his relationship with Sarah. She was lovely, kind, and perfect for him in a way that was both painful and reassuring to witness. They were a match set. Their light bounced off each other, amplifying it. My love for him became a secret, a darkroom where I developed my feelings in private, never letting them see the light of day. I became an expert in platonic affection, mastering the art of the casual hug, the friendly shoulder punch, the carefully measured distance. I learned to live with the low, constant ache of it, the way a person learns to live with a chronic pain. It was just a part of me, a shadow that walked beside me, invisible to everyone else. My friendship with Julian was the most important relationship in my life, and I would have sooner cut off my own arm than risk destroying it with the clumsy weight of my unrequited feelings. And for 8 years, it worked. The walls held. The first cracks in that carefully constructed dam appeared the night he called me from his car, parked 2 blocks away from the apartment he shared with Sarah. His voice was a raw, frayed thing, stripped of its usual confident timbre. He said her name just once, a shard of sound, and then he just breathed into the phone for a full minute. I didn't need him to say more. I knew that kind of silence. It was the sound of a world ending. I told him my address, the new one he'd only been to once to help me move in, and I left the door unlocked. When he arrived, he looked like a ship that had been torn from its moorings in a storm. He was hollowed out, his usual vibrant energy replaced by a vast, empty stillness. He didn't speak. He just walked to my couch, the same navy blue couch he was sleeping on now, and sat down, staring at the blank television screen as if it held the answers to the universe. That was the beginning of the shift, the catalyst. His breakup with Sarah wasn't a single, explosive event, but a slow, painful dissolution that had been happening for months. They had simply grown in different directions, their futures no longer aligning on the same map. It was a quiet, civilized heartbreak, which in some ways was the cruelest kind. There was no villain, no dramatic betrayal to rail against. There was only a profound and hollow sadness, a sense of failure that clung to him like the damp chill of a winter fog. He couldn't stay in their apartment, a space so saturated with shared memories that every object was a ghost. His parents lived halfway across the country, and his other friends, mostly couples, offered well-meaning but awkward condolences that only amplified his sense of being alone. So he came to me. He came to my quiet, uncluttered apartment, a neutral territory, a safe house from his own life. At first, it was just for a few hours in the evenings. He would bring takeout, and we would eat in comfortable silence. Or he would talk, circling the same painful points again and again, trying to map out where it had all gone wrong. I just listened. I didn't offer advice or platitudes. I just provided a space for his grief to exist without judgment. I became a repository for his sadness. He was a man who had always been surrounded by people, by noise, by activity. He didn't know how to be alone, and the silence of his new reality was deafening. My apartment, and my presence, became his buffer against it. He started staying later, long after the conversation had died down, until we were just coexisting in the soft glow of my reading lamp, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling. The first time he fell asleep on the couch, it felt accidental. He'd been mid-sentence, his voice trailing off, and when I looked over, his head had dropped to his chest, his body finally succumbing to the emotional exhaustion that had been holding him hostage for weeks. I didn't have the heart to wake him. I just pulled the spare blanket from the linen closet, draped it over him, and went to my own bed, my heart a complicated knot of sympathy and a terrifying, selfish flicker of hope. That accidental overnight stay became the first step in a new, unspoken ritual. He started leaving a change of clothes at my place, a toothbrush and a cup by the sink. He never explicitly asked to stay. He would just get that weary, haunted look in his eyes as the night wore on, and the question hung in the air between us, as tangible as smoke. The thought of him going back to an empty apartment, a space that was once a home and was now just a collection of rooms, felt unbearable to me, and apparently, to him as well. So, he would drift towards the couch, and I would drift towards the linen closet for the blanket. And this silent agreement became our new normal. He had a key to my apartment now. It seemed practical. Sometimes I would come home from a late shoot to find him already there, asleep on the couch, the television murmuring to an empty room. He was seeking sanctuary, and I was providing it. It was a simple, platonic arrangement born of crisis. That's what I told myself. It was a story that made sense, a story that kept the walls around my heart intact. But the foundation of that story began to erode. The couch, a well-defined territory, began to feel insufficient. It started one night when he woke up from a nightmare, a strangled cry pulling me from my own sleep. I found him sitting bolt upright, his face pale in the moonlight, his hands tangled in the blanket. He looked disoriented, lost. I sat on the edge of the coffee table, my voice soft, and talked him down from the ledge of his dream. He told me he dreamt he was swimming in an endless, black ocean, with no shoreline in sight. The metaphor was so painfully obvious it made my chest ache. He was treading water, and he was getting tired. His breath was still coming in ragged bursts, and on pure instinct, I reached out and put my hand on his knee. The contact was electric. He flinched, not away, but towards me, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. His breathing slowed, steadied by the simple, grounding pressure of my hand. "I hate sleeping alone," he whispered into the darkness, and the confession was so raw, so vulnerable. It felt like he'd handed me a piece of his soul. It wasn't a proposition or a hint. It was a simple statement of fact, a cry from the heart of his loneliness. And in that moment, the carefully drawn lines of our arrangement began to blur into an impressionistic landscape of need and unspoken affection. The space between my bedroom door and the living room couch suddenly felt like a vast, uncrossable chasm, an arbitrary boundary that was causing more pain than it was preventing. My bed was a queen, more than big enough. The thought was terrifying, a betrayal of the silent pact I'd made with myself years ago. But looking at his face, the deep, exhausted lines etched around his eyes, my self-preservation felt like a form of cruelty. "The couch is killing your back?" I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. You can take the bed. I'll take the couch." It was a clumsy, transparent offer, a way of opening a door while pretending I was only pointing at the hinges. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine in the dim light, and I saw a flicker of something I couldn't name. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was more complex, a mixture of gratitude and a deep, soul-shaking weariness. He shook his head. "No, man. It's your place. I can't kick you out of your own bed." The silence stretched, and I knew we were at a precipice. I could retreat, say goodnight, and leave him to his nightmares on the couch. Or I could take a step forward, into the unknown. "It's big enough," I heard myself say, the words leaving my mouth before my brain could veto them. "We can share. It's fine." He didn't answer for a long moment. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a slow, single nod. And just like that, a new ritual was born, one far more intimate and dangerous than the last. That first night was an exercise in agonizing self-control. I lay on the very edge of my side of the mattress, my body rigid, my muscles locked. I was acutely aware of him, of the heat radiating from his body just inches from mine, of the scent of his shampoo on the pillow, of the sound of his breathing, now slow and even, beside me. It was a sublime torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, sharing the most intimate of spaces, and yet the distance between us felt infinite, a gulf of unspoken things. I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to him sleep, my heart pounding out a frantic rhythm against the quiet backdrop of the night. This was not friendship. This was something else, something fragile and unnamed, and I had no idea how to navigate it without shattering it completely. The arrangement became routine. Most nights, Julian would end up in my bed. We established a silent choreography. He would take the side by the wall, and I would take the side by the door. We kept a careful, respectful distance between us, a buffer zone of cotton sheets and unspoken rules. We rarely touched, but the proximity itself was a form of touch, a constant pressure on my senses. I learned the topography of his sleep. I learned that he sometimes mumbled fragments of code or names of people I didn't know. I learned that he always kicked the covers off, his internal thermostat running hotter than mine. I learned that in the deepest hours of the night, he would sometimes shift, rolling closer, and the warmth of his back would press against mine for a few fleeting moments before he moved away again. These accidental touches were like sparks in the dark, igniting a wildfire of longing inside me that I had to constantly fight to extinguish. And that is when the lip biting started in earnest. Not the focused, work-related version, but the new one. The soft, contemplative one. It appeared in the quiet moments that now defined our lives. We'd be sitting at my small kitchen table, drinking coffee in the morning before he left for work. I'd say something, and he'd look at me, his eyes holding my gaze for a beat too long, and his lip would disappear between his teeth. Or we'd be watching a movie, sprawled at opposite ends of the couch, and during a quiet scene, I'd glance over and see him not watching the screen, but watching me, with that same pensive, unreadable expression, his teeth gently worrying his lower lip. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I couldn't read, a signal I couldn't decipher. I began to photograph him. Not for a project, not for anyone else to see. It was for me. I used my old film camera, the one that felt like an extension of my own hand. I didn't pose him. I just captured him as he was, existing in my space. Julian asleep in my bed, the morning light tracing the line of his spine. Julian at my kitchen counter, laughing at something on his phone, a dusting of powdered sugar from a donut on his chin. Julian standing by the window, looking out at the city, lost in thought, biting his lip. These photographs were different from the thousands I had taken of him in college. The old ones were about action, about performance, about the person he was to the world. These new ones were about stillness, about vulnerability, about the person he was when he thought no one was looking. They were an attempt to understand him, to understand us, to capture the subtle, shifting atmosphere of our new reality. They were also an act of profound selfishness, a way for me to possess these moments, to hold on to the intimacy that I was both terrified of and desperately craved. The internal monologue of my life became a constant, looping analysis of his every micro-expression. The lip bite was the central clue, the Rosetta Stone I believed could unlock the entire mystery. Was it a sign of his own buried feelings, a physical manifestation of a desire he couldn't or wouldn't articulate? Was he wrestling with the strangeness of our situation, the way our friendship had morphed into this pseudo-domestic partnership? Or was it simpler than that? Was it just stress? A meaningless tick, a neurological quirk onto which I was projecting my own mountain of hope and fear? I would lie awake at night, inches from him, and turn these questions over and over in my mind, examining them from every angle, like a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. Each possibility was both a comfort and a terror. The idea that he might feel something for me was a hope, so bright it was blinding. But the potential for misinterpretation was a fall from a height I was certain I would not survive. One Saturday afternoon, the tension that had been simmering between us reached a low boil. We were on the floor of my living room, surrounded by stacks of my photo books. He was idly flipping through one of my earliest collections, images of stark, lonely landscapes from a trip I'd taken out west years ago. I was cleaning the lens of my camera, a meticulous, repetitive task that helped to soothe my frayed nerves. The room was filled with the scent of dust motes dancing in the sunbeams and the faint, papery smell of old books. He was quiet for a long time, his finger tracing the edge of a photograph of a single, gnarled tree standing alone on a vast, empty plain. "You see things differently than other people," he said, his voice soft. He didn't look up from the book. "You always have. You find that the quiet parts, the things everyone else overlooks." I stopped polishing the lens, my heart giving a painful thud in my chest. "It's just about where you point the camera." He finally looked up, his eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, meeting mine. "No, it's not," he said, his gaze intense. "It's about what you see before you even pick it up." He closed the book and set it aside. And then he did it. He looked at me, his expression a complicated mix of affection and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable, and he bit his lip. Not a quick nip, but a slow, deliberate pressure, his eyes never leaving mine. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was charged, electric. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, the air still and humming with potential energy. I could feel my own pulse in my throat, a frantic, desperate beat. I wanted to ask. I wanted to shatter the silence and demand to know what he was thinking, what that gesture meant. But the fear was a physical thing, a hand clamped over my mouth. What if the answer was nothing? What if I pointed the camera at this moment, at this feeling between us, and the resulting photograph was empty? The weeks that followed were a masterclass in ambiguity. Our physical proximity increased, while the emotional distance seemed to grow. He would fall asleep with his head on my lap while we watched a movie, a gesture of such profound trust and intimacy that it made my breath catch in my throat. But then the next morning, he would be distant, almost formal, as if trying to re-establish the boundaries that had dissolved the night before. It was a constant push and pull, a dance of advance and retreat that was leaving me emotionally exhausted. I felt like I was living in a house where the walls were constantly shifting. I never knew where the solid ground was. He was building a home inside my life, stocking its metaphorical fridge, hanging pictures on its walls, and yet, he refused to acknowledge that he was even living there. His friends started to notice. He'd be on the phone with one of his old teammates, making plans, and the conversation would inevitably drift to his living situation. I'd hear his side of it, the carefully edited version. "Yeah, I'm crashing at Leo's for a bit. Just until I get my head straight." He made it sound temporary, a stopgap, a friend helping a friend. But it wasn't temporary anymore. It had been months. His own apartment was sitting empty, the lease set to expire in a few weeks, and he'd made no move to renew it or find a new place. He was living with me, but the words themselves, living with me, seemed to be a truth he couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. He was an unknowing initiator, pushing us deeper and deeper into this intimate space, while I was the quiet observer, documenting the changes, analyzing the data, and growing more and more terrified of the inevitable conclusion. The breaking point, the moment that finally forced the crossing, arrived on a Tuesday night. It was raining, a relentless, drumming downpour that sealed us inside the apartment, cutting us off from the rest of the world. The city outside was a watercolor painting of blurred lights and slick, black streets. We had ordered pizza and were sitting on the couch, the empty box on the coffee table between us like a flimsy barricade. The television was on, but neither of us was watching it. The sound was just a filler for the silence that had grown increasingly heavy between us. Julian was restless. He kept picking up his phone, scrolling aimlessly, then putting it back down. He'd run a hand through his hair, sigh, and stare at the rain-streaked window. He was a caged animal, prowling the confines of a space that had once been his sanctuary but was now, perhaps, beginning to feel like a trap. I watched him, my own anxiety a mirror of his. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a static charge that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He turned to look at me, his face illuminated by the flickering blue light of the television. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it. And then he bit his lip. It was the most intense, the most prolonged, the most heartbreakingly vulnerable version of the gesture I had ever seen. It was a confession, a question, and a plea, all wrapped up in one silent, anxious motion. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. The patient observer, the quiet documentarian, was done. I couldn't live in the gray space anymore. I couldn't spend another night analyzing clues and developing theories in the darkroom of my own mind. I needed the light. I needed the truth, whatever it was. You do that a lot. The words were quiet, barely a whisper, but they landed in the silence with the force of a thrown stone, shattering the surface of our carefully maintained peace. Julian froze, his eyes wide. He slowly released his lip, a faint red mark left behind from the pressure of his teeth. He looked at me, a deer caught in the headlights of a direct and unexpected question. The plausible deniability he had operated under for so long had just been stripped away. I had seen him. I had named the thing. "Do what?" he asked, his voice strained, though we both knew exactly what I was talking about. "That," I said, my gaze unwavering. "You bite your lip. When you're looking at me." A flush crept up his neck, a dark, telltale stain. He looked away, focusing on the meaningless drama unfolding on the television screen. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, unspoken silence of before. It was a sharp, brittle silence, fragile and dangerous. I had pushed us off the cliff, and now we were in freefall. I didn't know if we would learn to fly or if we would crash on the rocks below. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had risked everything, the most important friendship of my life, on the interpretation of a single, ambiguous gesture. He took a deep, shuddering breath, still not looking at me. Does it bother you?" he asked, his voice so low I could barely hear him over the sound of the rain. The question was a lifeline. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't laughed it off. He had asked how it made me feel. It was an opening, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. I could feel the tectonic plates of our relationship shifting beneath us, a deep, fundamental change that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake, all the hours I had spent cataloging his every move, all the hope and fear I had poured into that one small tick. "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly, but clear. "It doesn't bother me." That was it. That was the answer he was waiting for. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finally meeting mine again. The anxiety was still there, but it was mingled with something else now. A resolve. A decision made. He was done treading water. He was going to swim for a shore, one way or another. He shifted on the couch, closing the small distance between us. The empty pizza box was no longer a barrier. He was so close now I could feel the heat coming off his skin. I could see the faint constellation of freckles across the bridge of his nose. He didn't say anything. The time for words was over. This was a conversation that could only be finished in a different language. He lifted a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment in the air between us before gently touching my jaw. His touch was feather-light, tentative, a question in itself. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just watched his eyes, which were filled with a universe of fear and want. He leaned in, his movements agonizingly slow, giving me every possible opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to put the walls back up. But I was done with walls. I had spent a decade living behind them. I met him halfway, tilting my head, closing my eyes, and surrendering to the current that had been pulling us together for months. His lips were soft, hesitant. It wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was something far more profound. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was a quiet, careful exploration of a territory both of us had been terrified to chart. And then, I felt the gentle, familiar pressure. He wasn't biting his own lip anymore. He was biting mine. It was the softest of gestures, a ghost of the anxious habit I had obsessed over for so long. But this time, it wasn't a sign of his own internal conflict. It was a transfer. He was sharing his language with me, showing me the meaning of the word he could never speak. It meant what? It meant fear. It meant this is real. It meant I am here, with you, and I am terrified, but I am not leaving. In that single, tender, earth-shattering moment, all the questions that had haunted me for months were answered. The photograph finally came into focus, and the image it revealed was more beautiful and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. We were no longer just friends. We were something new, something unnamed, and we were standing at the very beginning of it, the rain still pouring down outside, washing the old world away. The morning after felt like waking up in a foreign country. The light was different, the air tasted strange, and the familiar landscape of my apartment seemed altered, every object imbued with a new and potent significance. The kiss had been a seismic event, and now we were left to navigate the aftershocks. When I woke up, Julian was already gone from the bed. I found him in the kitchen, fully dressed, staring into a mug of coffee as if it held the secrets to cold fusion. He didn't look at me when I entered the room. The easy, comfortable silence that had once defined our mornings was gone, replaced by a tense, crackling quiet. He was a fortress again, the drawbridge pulled up, the gates barred. The vulnerable man who had confessed everything with a single, gentle bite of my lip had vanished, and in his place was a stranger wearing my best friend's face. "Hey," I said, my voice rough with sleep. "Morning," he mumbled into his mug, his shoulders hunched. He looked like he was bracing for an impact. The withdrawal was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. I had allowed myself, for a few short hours, to believe. I had opened the door to that secret room in my heart and let the hope out into the open air. And now, in the cold, unforgiving light of day, I watched as he systematically tried to shove it all back inside, to pretend the night before had never happened. The fear I had lived with for years, the fear of misinterpretation, came roaring back with a vengeance. Had it all been a mistake? A moment of profound loneliness on his part, a response to the storm outside, and the storm inside him? Had I been nothing more than a convenient port, a temporary shelter he now regretted entering? The questions were a swarm of angry wasps in my head. He finished his coffee in 3 quick gulps, rinsed the mug in the sink with frantic, jerky movements, and grabbed his messenger bag from the floor. I've gotta get to work early, he said, his back still to me. Big project deadline. It was a lie, and we both knew it. He was running. He was fleeing the scene of the crime, the scene of the confession, because he couldn't face what it meant. He moved towards the door, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to leave without another word, without a single glance in my direction. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, his body rigid with tension. He still didn't turn around. I'll probably just crash at my place tonight, he said, the words clipped and unnatural. Need to sort through some stuff before the lease is up. And there it was. The retreat made official. He was not just leaving for the day. He was leaving the new reality we had created. He was trying to reset things, to rewind the tape back to a time before the kiss, before the shared beds, before the unspoken had been given a voice. The pain was a sharp, physical thing, a shard of glass in my chest. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, cutting through the hurt. Anger at him for his cowardice, and anger at myself for my foolish, hopeful heart. I said nothing. I just stood there, my own coffee growing cold in my hands, and listened to the sound of the door clicking shut behind him. The silence he left in his wake was the loudest, most painful sound I had ever heard. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. He didn't come back. He sent a single, terse text that evening. Hey, sorry about this morning. Just got a lot on my mind. It was a dismissal, a polite, cowardly brush-off. He was trying to manage my feelings, to soften the blow, but all it did was sharpen the edge of his rejection. My apartment, which had been a shared space, a home, for months, suddenly felt cavernous and empty. Every room echoed with his absence. His toothbrush was still in the cup by the sink, a lonely monument to a shared intimacy that now felt like a delusion. The indentation on his side of the bed was a hollow ache I couldn't bring myself to smooth over. I was haunted by the ghost of a future that had existed for less than 12 hours. I tried to work. I went into the darkroom, seeking solace in the familiar, methodical process. But my hands shook, and my focus was shattered. I looked at the photos I had taken of him, the ones I had hidden away like secret treasures. The image of him by the window, biting his lip, was no longer a beautiful mystery. It was a taunt. It was evidence of my own naivety, my willingness to see what I wanted to see. I had built an entire narrative on a foundation of subtle gestures and wishful thinking, and the entire structure had come crashing down around me. The quiet observer had failed. I had misinterpreted the data, and the conclusion was devastating. After 3 days of this radio silence, of this agonizing uncertainty, I knew I couldn't let it end this way. I couldn't let our decade of friendship and the fragile, beautiful thing that had grown out of it die in a quiet, cowardly retreat. If it was over, I needed to hear it from him. I needed to see it in his eyes. I needed an ending, not just a disappearance. The anger returned, but this time it was a different kind of anger. It was a clarifying fire, burning away the hurt and the self-pity, leaving behind a hard, clear resolve. I would not let him erase what had happened between us. I would not let him treat our connection and my heart as collateral damage in his own internal war. I drove to his old apartment that evening, the one he still paid for but hadn't lived in for months. I didn't know if he would be there, but it was the only place I could think to go. As I walked down the hallway of his building, I could hear music coming from under his door. It was a sad, ambient track, the kind of music you listen to when you want to wallow. My heart was pounding, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hall. The music stopped. I heard footsteps, a hesitation, and then the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches, and he peered out. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, and he hadn't shaved in days. He was wearing a faded college sweatshirt, a relic from a simpler time. When he saw it was me, the flicker of hope in his eyes was immediately extinguished, replaced by a look of pure, cornered panic. He tried to close the door, a reflexive, cowardly instinct. "Julian, don't," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I put my hand on the door, holding it open. "We need to talk." Leo, now's not a good time, he said, his voice a low rasp. He wouldn't meet my eyes. No, I said, pushing the door open and stepping inside, forcing the confrontation he was so desperate to avoid. We're not doing this. You don't get to kiss me like that. You don't get to tear my entire world off its axis and then just disappear. You don't get to be a coward. The word coward hung in the air between us, sharp and ugly. It hit its mark. He flinched as if I'd physically struck him. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery so profound it almost broke my resolve. The apartment was a disaster zone. Half-packed boxes were everywhere, a chaotic landscape of a life in disarray. You don't understand, he whispered, his voice cracking. Then make me understand. I shot back, my frustration boiling over. Because right now, all I understand is that you felt something, or you pretended to feel something, to get you through a lonely night. And I need to know which one it is. I deserve to know. He sank down onto a sealed cardboard box, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and a sound, a raw, ragged sob, was torn from his chest. The sight of him, my strong, confident, charismatic Julian, so completely broken, shattered my anger, and all that was left was a deep, aching love for this impossibly confused man. I crossed the room and knelt in front of him, my anger gone, replaced by a quiet, urgent need to close the distance he had put between us. Talk to me, Jules, I said, my voice soft now. Please. He took a long, shuddering breath and slowly lifted his head. His face was a mess of tears and confusion. I'm so scared, Leo, he admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. I've spent my whole life on this one track. You know? Go to school, get the girl, get the job, get the house. It was all laid out. I knew who I was. And then Sarah and I ended, and the whole track just disappeared from under my feet. I was lost. And you were the only solid ground I could find. He paused, swiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Being with you, in your apartment, it was the only time I felt safe. The only time the noise in my head stopped. And I leaned into it. I needed it. I needed you. But I didn't let myself think about what it meant. I just took the comfort you were offering. And the other night? I prompted gently. Was that just comfort too? He shook his head vehemently, a fresh wave of tears welling in his eyes. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That's what's messing me up so bad. I thought it was. I told myself it was just proximity, loneliness. But when I kissed you, it wasn't about being lonely anymore. It was about you. It was about the way you look at me like you can see right through me. It was about the way your apartment is the only place in the world that feels like home. It was about the fact that the thought of going back to my life before, the life without you at the center of it, feels impossible. It feels like trying to breathe underwater. He finally looked me square in the eye, his own gaze filled with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. I have feelings for you, Leo. Real ones. And it terrifies me. It terrifies me because I don't know what it means. It doesn't fit into any of the boxes I built for my life. And I woke up that morning, and all I could feel was this overwhelming panic. So I ran. Because I'm a coward. You were right. His confession, so honest and raw and painful, was the key that unlocked everything. All the ambiguity, all the uncertainty, dissolved in the face of his messy, terrified truth. He wasn't rejecting me. He was wrestling with himself, with a fundamental shift in his own identity. And in that moment, I understood. The fear he felt was a mirror of the fear I had lived with for a decade. The fear of the unknown, the fear of risking everything for a truth that could change the world. I reached out and took his hands in mine. They were cold and trembling. Hey, I said softly, waiting until he met my eyes. It's okay to be scared. I've been scared for 10 years. His eyes widened in surprise. What? I'm in love with you, Julian, I said, the words I had guarded for a lifetime finally spoken aloud. I have been since we were kids. I just got very, very good at hiding it. A look of dawning comprehension spread across his face, followed by a wave of regret so profound it was almost painful to witness. He understood, in that instant, all the little moments, all the quiet observations, all the years of my patient, unwavering friendship. He understood the context for everything. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He squeezed my hands, his grip desperate. God, Leo, he whispered. I've been so blind. You weren't blind, I said, shaking my head. You just weren't looking. And that's okay. But you're looking now. We both are. I gave him a small, watery smile. So what do you see? He didn't need to answer with words. He leaned forward, closing the last few inches between us, and kissed me again. This kiss was different from the first. The fear and hesitation were gone, replaced by a certainty, a relief so profound it felt like coming home. It was a kiss that said thank you. It was a kiss that said I see you. It was a kiss that said, I'm done running. We stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the floor of his half-empty apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of his old life, and slowly, carefully, began to build a new one together. There was no sudden, magical resolution. The fear didn't vanish overnight. We had to learn a new language, a new way of being with each other. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of advance and exploration. We talked. We talked more than we had in 10 years of friendship, laying our fears and hopes and histories bare. He had to dismantle the identity he had constructed for himself and come to terms with the fact that the future he had always planned was not the one that would make him happy. I had to learn to trust that this was real, to let go of the deeply ingrained habit of self-protection and believe that I was worthy of the love I was being offered. He let the lease on his old apartment expire. We packed up the last of his things together, a symbolic act of closing a door on the past. We didn't talk about him moving in with me. The words felt too formal, too freighted with expectation. He just stayed. His toothbrush was no longer a lonely relic. It was just his toothbrush. His clothes found their way from his duffel bag into my dresser drawers. His presence in my apartment was no longer a temporary arrangement born of crisis. It was the new, quiet, wonderful normal. The line between my space and our space simply dissolved. The physical intimacy between us blossomed slowly, tenderly. It wasn't a rush of passion, but a gradual, gentle exploration. It was holding hands while we walked down the street, a simple, public act of ownership that felt revolutionary. It was the way he would wrap his arms around me from behind while I was making coffee in the morning, resting his chin on my shoulder and breathing in the scent of the fresh grounds. It was sleeping in the same bed, not with a careful buffer zone between us, but tangled together, his arm thrown possessively over my waist, my head tucked into the curve of his neck. The bed was no longer a landscape of agonizing temptation. It was a sanctuary, a place of profound peace and safety. He still bit his lip. The habit didn't disappear, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer a signal of his internal conflict or a mystery for me to decipher. It became a part of our shared language. He would do it when he was watching me work in the darkroom, a look of quiet admiration on his face. He would do it when I said something that made him laugh, a precursor to a smile. It was a gesture of affection, of tenderness, of a love that was still too new and too profound for him to always find the right words for. And sometimes, when he did it, I would reach out, gently pull his lower lip free with my thumb, and kiss him. A quiet reminder that he didn't have to hold it in anymore. He didn't have to be afraid. One evening, months after that terrible, wonderful confrontation in his old apartment, we were lying on the couch, my head on his chest, his fingers idly tracing patterns on my arm. The television was murmuring, the city lights were twinkling outside the window, and a sense of deep, unshakable peace filled the room. It was the kind of quiet contentment I had never thought I would be allowed to have. I thought about the first night he had crashed here, a broken man seeking refuge. I thought about the journey we had taken, from the couch to the bed, from friendship to love, from ambiguity to certainty. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. I smiled, tilting my head back to look at him. "Just this," I said. "How we got here." He looked down at me, his brown eyes soft in the dim light. A slow, gentle smile spread across his face. He leaned down and kissed me, a long, lingering kiss that was full of a quiet, confident love. He pulled back just enough to look at me, and I watched, fascinated, as he caught his lower lip between his teeth for just a second, a silent, affectionate punctuation mark. "Me too," he whispered. "I think about it all the time. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a friend in need, a quiet evening, a nervous habit. You don't recognize them as turning points at the time. It's only in looking back that you can see the precise instant the current shifted, the moment you were pulled from the familiar waters into a vast and unknown ocean. You can fight the pull, you can try to swim back to the shore you know, or you can surrender to it, trust it, and let it carry you towards a horizon you never could have imagined. We had been adrift, two people lost in our own separate oceans of loneliness and fear, until we found each other. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together, we stopped just treading water. We began to build a home.